The morning was quiet, the streets of Crestwood bustling with early risers heading to work. The jewelry store on the corner, an upscale spot named Pinnacle Jewels, was already open for business. Inside, the glass display cases gleamed under soft halogen lights, showcasing rows of elegant rings, necklaces, and bracelets. The staff moved with practiced precision, assisting the few customers browsing the store. It was just after 10 a.m. when Vanessa Jacobs stepped through the door. She was dressed impeccably in a tailored navy blazer and slacks, her hair pulled back into a sleek ponytail. Vanessa had come to pick out a gift for her mother's upcoming birthday, a diamond necklace she had been saving for. She smiled warmly at the clerk behind the counter and began to examine the glittering pieces on display. At the same moment, Officer Henry George parked his patrol car just outside. A long-serving member of the Crestwood Police Department, George was known for his no-nonsense approach to his duties. He stepped out of the car, adjusting the brim of his hat, his eyes scanning the sidewalk before moving purposefully toward the store. The owner of Pinnacle Jewels, Mr. White, had called the police earlier that week, complaining about a string of thefts in the area. George had volunteered to keep an eye on things. As George entered the store, he nodded briefly to the staff, his gaze sweeping the room. His eyes fell on Vanessa. She was leaning over one of the counters, speaking with the clerk. Her movements were slow and deliberate, but to George, something about the scene seemed off. Vanessa pointed to a necklace inside the case, smiling as the clerk retrieved it for her to inspect. George's stance stiffened. His years on the force had trained him to look for subtle signs, movements, expressions, body language. But in this moment, his instincts were clouded by assumptions. He walked closer, his boots clicking sharply on the tile floor. Vanessa glanced up briefly, acknowledging him with a polite nod, but George's expression remained hard. He stood just a few feet away now, arms crossed, watching her every move. The clerk, sensing the tension, hesitated before handing Vanessa the necklace. Vanessa noticed his presence but chose to ignore it, focusing instead on the necklace in her hands. She examined the piece carefully, her fingers tracing the delicate chain. "It's beautiful," she said to the clerk, her voice warm and genuine. That's when George stepped forward. His voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet hum of the store. "What are you doing with that?" he demanded. Vanessa looked up, startled. "I'm looking at it," she replied calmly, holding up the necklace as if to demonstrate. George's jaw tightened. "It's expensive," he said, his tone carrying an edge. "Do you even plan on paying for it?" The clerk started to speak up, but George raised a hand to silence him. Vanessa set the necklace back on the counter and met George's gaze. "I don't see why you're questioning me," she said firmly. "I haven't done anything wrong." But George wasn't convinced. "Stay right here," he ordered, reaching for his radio. Other customers began to notice the exchange. A man in a suit paused mid-sentence on his phone, watching from the corner of his eye. A young couple whispered to each other as the atmosphere in the store shifted. Before Vanessa could respond, George reached for her wrist. "You're coming with me," he said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Gasps rippled through the store as Vanessa resisted, her voice calm but firm. "This is unnecessary," she said. "You're making a mistake." George wasn't listening. Within moments, Vanessa was escorted out of the store, her hands cuffed behind her back. Outside, a small crowd began to gather. Some pulled out their phones, recording the scene. Vanessa glanced at the cameras, her expression unflinching. "This isn't over," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the situation. As Vanessa was placed into the back of the patrol car, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder. But this was only the beginning. What happened next would not just change her life. It would challenge everything George thought he knew about justice. Before we continue, we've noticed that 80% of our viewers haven't subscribed to this channel. Your support makes all the difference. Please take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications to stay updated with impactful stories like this one. Together, we can raise awareness, spark meaningful conversations, and say no to racism. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters. What happened next would not just change her life. It would challenge everything George thought he knew about justice. But before that confrontation could unfold, There were stories behind each of them that led them to this moment. Stories shaped by experiences, choices, and beliefs that had been building for years. Henry George had always considered himself a man of principles. Born and raised in a small rural town, George's upbringing was shaped by a strict, no-nonsense father who served in the military. Discipline was the rule of the house, and any deviation was met with swift correction. His father often spoke of order and respect, concepts George absorbed without question. As a child, he idolized law enforcement, seeing police officers as the ultimate enforcers of those values. But George's admiration for authority came with a narrow worldview. Growing up in a predominantly white community, his interactions with people of different races were limited. The media he consumed and the conversations around him painted certain groups and stereotypes, images that went unchallenged throughout his youth. When he joined the police force in Crestwood, he carried those unconscious biases with him, even as he believed he was doing his duty fairly. Over the years, the job reinforced George's rigid outlook. He often found himself patrolling neighborhoods where tensions were high, and his experiences began to form patterns in his mind, patterns that weren't always rooted in reality. To George, suspicion wasn't personal, it was practical. And yet, his actions often blurred the line between caution and prejudice. He didn't see it that way, of course. To him, he was simply doing what was necessary to keep order. Vanessa's journey was vastly different. Raised in the bustling city of Atlanta, she grew up in a close-knit Black community that instilled pride and resilience. Her mother, a teacher, and her father, a small business owner, worked tirelessly to provide for their family. They encouraged Vanessa to dream big and to believe that her success was not just for herself, but for those who would follow in her footsteps. Vanessa excelled academically and went on to study business at a prestigious university, where she often found herself one of the few Black students in her classes. While she thrived, she couldn't ignore the subtle slights and assumptions from peers and professors. She learned to navigate those challenges with grace, but they left an indelible mark. After graduation, Vanessa returned to her roots, determined to give back to her community. She launched a successful nonprofit organization aimed at mentoring young women of color, teaching them skills in entrepreneurship and leadership. Her reputation grew as someone who not only spoke about change, but actively created it. She became a beacon of hope for many, a symbol of what perseverance could achieve. When George placed Vanessa in handcuffs that morning, he didn't know any of this. To him, she was just another suspect. And for Vanessa, George was not the first person to underestimate her, but his actions struck a nerve that ran deep. It wasn't just the indignity of being falsely accused. It was the years of hard work, the sacrifices, the quiet battles fought to be seen as equal, that seemed to be erased in an instant. The irony was stark. George believed he was enforcing justice, yet his actions revealed a system that often worked against people like Vanessa. And Vanessa, who had built a life on lifting others up, found herself the target of the very forces she had been fighting to overcome. Their collision wasn't just a momentary clash. It was a culmination of histories and beliefs that had been years in the making. And while George couldn't yet see the implications of his actions, Vanessa was already preparing to respond. For her, this wasn't just a personal fight. It was a stand for every young girl she mentored, every person who had been treated unjustly, every voice that had been silenced. And as the hours unfolded, George would be forced to confront the cracks in his own beliefs, cracks that Vanessa's strength would make impossible to ignore. The stage was set for a reckoning that neither of them could have anticipated. The lines had been drawn, but the story was far from over. The confrontation that lay ahead would challenge George in ways he had never experienced and reveal a side of Vanessa that the world needed to see. What happened next would not just be a lesson for one man. It would ripple far beyond the walls of a jewelry store and a police station. It began quietly with a single phone call, but within hours, the events of that morning began to take on a life of their own, pulling both Vanessa and George into the center of a growing storm. In the small holding cell where she had been placed, Vanessa sat calmly, her mind working as she pieced together her next steps. She knew this wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about using her voice to expose a deeper issue. When her lawyer, Adrian Wells, arrived, Vanessa was ready. Together, they made the decision to go public. Adrian wasted no time. She began drafting a statement while Vanessa reached out to her network of community leaders and media contacts. Meanwhile, a customer from the jewelry store had already uploaded a video of the incident. Within hours, the clip began to circulate online, sparking outrage. It showed Vanessa, composed and respectful, being led out of the store in handcuffs while bystanders murmured in disbelief. The caption read, "Black woman falsely arrested for shopping." Back at the station, George was wrapping up the paperwork for Vanessa's arrest when his commanding officer called him into a meeting. "There's a situation brewing," Captain Edwards said, sliding a tablet across the desk. On the screen was the now viral video. George frowned as he watched the footage, the murmurs of the crowd audible even through the device's small speakers. "What's the issue?" George asked, his tone defensive. "I followed protocol." But Edwards wasn't convinced. "You might want to take a closer look at the woman you arrested," he said. "Do you know who she is?" George bristled. To him, it didn't matter who Vanessa was. The facts spoke for themselves. Or so he thought. But as Edwards continued to explain Vanessa's reputation and the backlash already forming, George began to feel the weight of his decision. His once unshakable confidence wavered, though he wouldn't admit it. As the video gained traction, social media erupted with calls for justice. Hashtag Justice for Vanessa began trending nationwide. Prominent activists and celebrities joined the conversation, amplifying the outrage. Local news stations picked up the story, and soon, national outlets were calling for interviews. Vanessa, with Adrian by her side, agreed to speak publicly. Standing before a sea of reporters, Vanessa addressed the crowd. Her voice was steady, her words carefully chosen. "This isn't just about me," she said. "It's about a pattern, a system that continues to devalue and criminalize people of color. I was shopping, not stealing. But because of how I look, I was treated as a threat." Her statement struck a chord. People across the country began sharing their own stories of racial profiling, turning Vanessa's experience into a rallying cry for change. But for George, the fallout was personal. Protesters gathered outside the police station, some holding signs that read, "Accountability now." Others chanted Vanessa's name, demanding justice. It was late afternoon when Adrian and Vanessa arrived at the police station for her release. The crowd outside parted as they approached, applause and cheers ringing out in support. Inside, George sat at his desk, staring at the file in front of him. He knew Vanessa was coming, and for the first time in years, he felt unsure of what to say. When Vanessa entered the room, their eyes met. She didn't speak immediately, allowing the silence to linger. George stood, his hands resting on the edge of the desk. "Miss Jacobs," he began, but she raised a hand to stop him. "Officer George," she said, her tone measured. "Do you understand what you've done?" Her question was pointed, but her voice carried no malice. George hesitated, then replied, "I was doing my job." Vanessa stepped closer. "Your job? Your job is to protect and serve, isn't it? Tell me, how did I threaten anyone in that store? What crime did I commit?" Her words were sharp, cutting through George's defenses. He opened his mouth to respond, but no answer came. He realized, for the first time, he didn't have one. As the conversation continued, Vanessa refused to let up. She recounted her experience, each word peeling back the layers of George's assumptions. "I worked for years to get where I am," she said, "and in a matter of minutes, you reduced me to a criminal in front of a room full of people. Do you know what that feels like?" George's face hardened, but his silence betrayed him. He knew she was right. Every justification he had leaned on for years felt flimsy now, crumbling under the weight of her words. The room seemed to close in around him, the noise of the protesters outside growing louder. Vanessa turned to leave, her voice steady but firm as she delivered her final words. "You don't have to answer me, Officer George, but you do have to answer to yourself. And to them," she added, gesturing toward the window, where the crowd's chants filled the air. "I hope you're ready for that." As the door closed behind her, George sank back into his chair. For the first time in his career, he questioned not just his actions, but the principles that had guided them. And as the noise outside grew louder, he realized there would be no escaping the consequences of that morning. The crowd demanded answers, and for the first time in years, Officer George wasn't sure if he had any to give. But what he didn't yet know was that this moment wasn't just about accountability, it was about transformation. The following days were a whirlwind of scrutiny and reflection for George. Internal Affairs launched an investigation into his actions, demanding a full report on the incident. He spent hours reliving that moment in the jewelry store, replaying every word, every decision, and every assumption he had made. The questions from investigators were pointed, leaving little room for excuses. Meanwhile, Vanessa's story continued to gain traction. Interviews with national news outlets painted her as a beacon of strength, someone who had turned a painful moment into an opportunity for change. "This isn't about tearing anyone down," she said in one interview. "It's about building something better, because we all deserve better." Her words resonated deeply, and organizations began reaching out to her, offering support for her nonprofit and its mission. As part of the department's response to the backlash, George and his colleagues were ordered to attend a series of bias and sensitivity training sessions. George approached the first session with skepticism, his arms crossed as he sat in the back of the room. He had heard the terms before: implicit bias, systemic racism, but he had never truly confronted what they meant. The trainer, a retired officer named Marcus Holloway, began the session with a simple exercise. "Close your eyes," Marcus instructed. "Now think about the last time you made a snap judgment about someone. What were you basing it on? Their actions? Or something else?" George resisted at first, keeping his arms crossed, but eventually he played along. As Marcus spoke, George's mind returned to Vanessa's face in the store. He remembered the way she had calmly explained herself, how her actions had given him no real reason to suspect her. And yet, he had acted on something deeper, something he hadn't fully understood until now. While George struggled with his realizations, Vanessa was taking action. She organized a town hall meeting, inviting community members, activists, and law enforcement officers to discuss issues of racial profiling and policing. The event was packed, with people spilling out of the venue and onto the sidewalks. Vanessa stood at the front of the room, poised and confident, as she opened the discussion. "We're not here to point fingers," she began. "We're here to have honest conversations. Because change doesn't come from silence." The audience erupted in applause. Throughout the evening, Vanessa facilitated a series of discussions, giving voice to those who had experienced discrimination and encouraging officers to share their perspectives as well. It wasn't easy. There were moments of tension and frustration, but by the end of the night, it was clear that the conversation had made an impact. As George continued attending the training sessions, something began to shift. During one exercise, participants were asked to pair up and share a personal story of bias they had faced or exhibited. George was paired with Marcus, the trainer, who shared his experience as a black officer navigating the dual challenges of racial profiling and internal discrimination within the force. Marcus's story hit George harder than he expected. "I've been where you are," Marcus said, "thinking I was just doing my job, thinking my intentions were enough. But intentions aren't actions, and actions have consequences." George sat quietly, absorbing Marcus's words. For the first time, he saw himself not just as a victim of circumstance, but as an active participant in a flawed system. It was a hard pill to swallow, but he knew it was necessary. At Adrienne's suggestion, Vanessa agreed to meet with George in a mediated setting. The meeting was tense at first, with both sides unsure of what to say. Vanessa broke the silence. "I don't want an apology if it's just words," she said. "I want to know what you've learned. What will you do differently?" George looked down, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. For a moment, he considered giving a rehearsed response, something polished and safe. But as he looked up and met Vanessa's gaze, he decided against it. "I was wrong," he said simply. "Not just in how I treated you, but in how I viewed people for years. I've been blind to things I should have seen a long time ago." His voice wavered, but he continued. "I can't change what I did that day, but I can change what I do from now on." Vanessa nodded, her expression unreadable. "Then show me," she said. "Show all of us." The meeting marked a turning point. George began volunteering at Vanessa's nonprofit, mentoring young men who were interested in pursuing careers in law enforcement. At first, his presence was met with skepticism, but over time, he proved himself through his actions. He listened, he learned, and he shared his own journey of growth, hoping to inspire others to confront their own biases. Meanwhile, Vanessa's Town Hall initiative grew into a series of events held across the state, each one drawing larger crowds and fostering deeper conversations. Her work gained national attention, leading to partnerships with advocacy groups and government agencies. For George, the journey was far from over. Each day brought new challenges, new lessons, and new opportunities to make amends. For Vanessa, the fight for justice continued, fueled by the belief that change was possible. Together, their paths formed a story that resonated far beyond their town. A story of accountability, redemption, and the power of facing hard truths head-on. But as their work continued, one question remained. Would their efforts be enough to spark the lasting change they both hoped for? The journey toward resolution was far from simple, and the answer was not one they could find on their own. It would take the voices of a community, the courage to challenge ingrained systems, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Officer George's transformation was slow and deliberate. Each day at Vanessa's nonprofit was a test of his sincerity. He didn't just show up. He participated, humbling himself as he listened to the stories of young men and women who had faced the very biases he had once upheld. Some were hesitant to trust him, and rightfully so, but George accepted their doubt as part of his journey. At one session, a teenager named Malik shared his experience of being stopped by the police while walking home from basketball practice. His voice wavered as he described the humiliation he felt, the fear that gripped him when the officer reached for his holster. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," Malik said, "but I felt like I didn't matter." George listened intently, his own memories of similar stops flashing through his mind. For the first time, he understood the lasting impact of those moments. Meanwhile, Vanessa's work had expanded beyond what she ever imagined. Her nonprofit received grants and donations from across the country, allowing her to establish programs in multiple cities. Each new chapter of her organization brought communities together, fostering dialogue between citizens and law enforcement. Vanessa became a sought-after speaker, addressing universities, conferences, and even lawmakers about the systemic changes needed to combat racial profiling. But despite her success, Vanessa remained grounded. She often returned to Crestwood, holding local workshops and attending meetings with the very people who had supported her from the start. "This isn't just my victory," she said at one event. "It's ours. And we're not done yet." As George continued his work, he began advocating for reforms within the Crestwood Police Department. He collaborated with Vanessa to propose changes in how officers were trained, focusing on de-escalation techniques and bias awareness. It wasn't easy. Many of his colleagues resisted, viewing the changes as unnecessary or accusatory. But George persisted, using his own story as evidence of why the reforms were essential. At a public meeting held to discuss the proposed changes, tensions ran high. Some officers voiced their frustrations, while community members shared stories of distrust and fear. Vanessa stood alongside George as he addressed the room. "This isn't about blaming anyone," he said. "It's about building trust. It's about making sure every person in this community feels safe, no matter who they are." His words were met with a mix of skepticism and applause, but they marked a turning point in the conversation. Months after the incident at the jewelry store, George approached Vanessa privately. He had apologized before, but this time, it was different. "I need you to know," he said, his voice steady but earnest, "that meeting you changed me. I didn't just see you as a suspect that day. I saw you as a threat, and that was wrong. I'll carry that regret for the rest of my life, but I hope my actions now can honor the person you are." Vanessa listened quietly, then placed a hand on his shoulder. "What matters is what you do going forward," she replied. "You've already started. Keep going." The partnership between Vanessa and George became a symbol of what was possible when people chose to confront their biases and work together for change. Their story was featured in documentaries, news segments, and online platforms, inspiring similar initiatives in other communities. Schools adopted Vanessa's workshops into their curriculums, while police departments across the state reached out for guidance on implementing reforms. More importantly, their story sparked conversations in households, workplaces, and schools. People began questioning their own assumptions, challenging the narratives they had grown up believing. It wasn't a perfect solution. Systemic change would take years, even decades, but it was a start. And for Vanessa and George, that was enough. As time passed, Vanessa's organization became a cornerstone of the community. Its programs produced young leaders who carried her message forward, each one a testament to her belief in the power of education and empowerment. George, now retired from the force, continued to mentor aspiring officers, ensuring that his mistakes would not be repeated by the next generation. At the annual gala for Vanessa's nonprofit, George was invited to speak. Standing before a crowd of hundreds, he reflected on the journey that had brought him there. "I thought I understood justice," he said, "but Vanessa taught me what it really means. It's not just about enforcing laws. It's about empathy, fairness, and seeing people for who they are, not who we assume them to be." Vanessa joined him on stage, the two standing side by side. "Change isn't easy," she said, addressing the audience. "But it's possible. And it starts with each of us choosing to see the humanity in one another." The jewelry store incident had been a moment of humiliation and injustice, but it became the catalyst for something greater. It reshaped lives, challenged perceptions, and planted the seeds for lasting change. Vanessa's resilience and George's willingness to confront his flaws proved that even the most entrenched biases could be dismantled, one step at a time. And while their work was far from finished, their story served as a reminder of what could be achieved when people chose courage over comfort, action over apathy, and hope over despair. Because sometimes the hardest lessons lead to the most meaningful change.